Good morning. Oh, come on, come on. Good morning.
Good morning.
There you go. That's what I was looking for. I'm a professor at UNO, and as a professor, I always want to ensure that I am answering the question that was asked. It's easier to just make up an answer to another question if you don't know it, but I feel like I should answer the question that was asked. The problem is, in this case, I think this is the wrong question. Now, how do you like that? I'm alienating half my audience already since this is the most asked question. But let me show you what I mean from my own personal experience. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Grief Observed, made this comment. He says, all nonsense questions are unanswerable. For example, how many hours are there in a mile? Is yellow round or square? Then he goes on to say, probably half the questions we ask, half of our great theological and metaphysical problems are just like that. And as I look at this question of why, I want to share with you my journey through that question. When I was 2 years old, I contracted pneumonia. Contracted pneumonia and was hospitalized. I was put in the hospital, and after recovering, I was brought home and was toddling across the floor, and I'm sure I was cute. I didn't have a beard then, obviously. I was toddling across the living room floor and then collapsed in a pile. My mom said she knew immediately what it was. The year was 1952, and we were in the midst of a major polio outbreak. The vaccines didn't come about until 1955. And so I was immediately rushed back into the hospital, this time with polio. I went to the hospital originally with pneumonia, but the hospital staff did not do an adequate job of isolating polio patients, and so I came home with polio. Rushed back into the hospital, and I was placed in an iron lung. Now, most of you don't have any idea what an iron lung is. It's a big iron tube that fit tight around your neck and that would compress and decompress and help you to breathe if you couldn't breathe on your own. It was big, it was noisy, it was frightening. My earliest memory as a 2-year-old was laying in that iron lung and the fear and the loneliness of being there. I was isolated, and this big machine was breathing for me. I can remember turning my neck and cranking around, trying to watch the door, hoping somebody would come in and keep me company. Fast forward a few years. I grew up in a church. I knew that if there was a God, he had to be all-powerful. If he wasn't all-powerful, he wouldn't be God, would he? And so if he was all-powerful, then why did he not prevent me from getting polio? Why did he allow that to happen? And this did not sound like a God with whom I wanted to associate, so I disassociated and walked away. Fast forward a few more years. My senior year in high school, I committed my life to following Jesus. Now, how that happened is another story for another time. But I still had to wrestle with the why question. God, why? Why didn't you prevent the polio? Why do I need a leg brace and a cane? I was so convinced of his love, yet the question remained. So this is when I turned to his word for answers. And I made a life-altering discovery. I was asking the wrong question, and hence not receiving an answer. God showed me a lot of great things in that study. One, Jacob, when he was wrestling with God, God touched his hip, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. God said, if it's good enough for Israel, it's good enough for you. With David, learned to say with Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and I know this full well. But the passages that I want to go over with us today that really, really brought this home to me, the first one is John 9. And we're going to look through it a little bit. John 9, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, that this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Do you see what the disciples are doing? They're asking why. Why is this guy born blind? He's been blind for 30 years, God. Why, Rabbi, why? And Jesus' answer it just blew me away. It was not that this man sinned or his parents sinned, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. I love the way J.B. Phillips, the paraphrase, deals with this. He says, he was not born blind because of his own sin or that of his parents, returned Jesus, but to show the power of God at work in him. The disciples were asking the why question. The dominant thought of the day was that suffering was an output of sin. So who sinned? He was born blind. Did he sin in the womb? Did his parents sin? What's going on? Why? But Jesus said it has nothing to do with the sin, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. The rest of the story goes on to show the power of God at work in him. I really suggest you read John 9. It's a great study. But we're focusing on these first 3 verses. But here's the issue. The man was blind for 30 years, all coming to this point in his life that the power of God could be displayed in and through his life. This drove home the question to me that why is not the right question. The right question is how. How is God using the suffering, the hardships in your life to demonstrate his power for his glory to you and to those who are around you? How was the right question. And how can he be glorified in my life and the lives of those around me through my suffering? That's a hard move to go from why to how. And it's not one that we can do easily or simply. The follow-on, this is where 2 Corinthians 12 comes in. There's no argument that Paul was a great man of God. Paul had done great miracles for God. Paul's written a huge portion of the New Testament. And yet he had a thorn in his flesh. And it bothered him. Now, we don't know what that was. Some people say it was his eyesight. Some people say it was, he walked with a limp. I happen to believe at one time that it was probably his mother-in-law. Some of you laughed a little too hard. But actually, it was a physical ailment of some sort. And it bothered Paul. We know that because of the passage. 2 Corinthians 12, 8 through 10 says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this. He was pleading with God that it should leave me. But the Lord said to him, every time, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Note God's response. My grace is sufficient for you. How do I move from why to how? By leaning hard into God's grace. Leaning hard into God's grace. And live in reliance on him and him alone. His power is made perfect in weakness. So we can trust him in our hardships, that he will impact our life and the lives of those around us by leaning into his grace. I can remember growing up. As a young lad, I figured God gave me a hard stare because people would stare at somebody walking with a leg brace. So I would stare back. I had a grade school teacher in 4th grade who spent the whole year telling me, Ken, you're never going to make it in this world physically. You're going to have to make it with your mind. All she did was make me feel inferior physically. I had a grandmother, when I walked into the room, would just shake her head and go, I know what Paul meant when he said, I am content with my weaknesses, my insults, my hardships. I grew up with that. But I learned I needed to lean into God's grace because his grace is sufficient for me, no matter what else happens. Let me show you how God has revealed the truth to me. God has really been gracious. At times, he will open the curtain and let me see what he is doing. And then he quickly closes it again and says, Ken, I'm not going to show you anymore because you'll get a big head. And so, but he's opened the curtain a few times. When I was back in that iron lung, my grandfather was starting to leave the church and wander around, and he was really a kind of a scoundrel, a very rough and gruff type of man. And as I lay in the hospital, the family was unsure if I were to live or die. If the paralysis from the virus of polio would just settle into my heart and lungs, I was dead. If it just stayed, in a limb, I would live. But they didn't know. They didn't know at this time if I was going to live or die. And so years later, I learned that Grandpa at that point got down on his knees before God and said, if you save that boy's life, you can have mine too. Now, I'm not into the theology of trying to bargain with God because we really don't have a chip in that bargain. But in Grandpa's theology, he was pleading for my life. And obviously, God answered that prayer. I'm here. That was supposed to be kind of a joke. Okay, thanks. They didn't laugh at the other service either. I don't understand. Okay. I think I'll take that one out. But years later, Grandpa moved in with us because he was no longer able to take care of himself. And we shared a room. And every night, I saw him struggle as he got down on his knees to pray. Every night, just like he did for me those years before. Grandpa kept his word. All it cost me was the use of a leg. No big deal. Another vignette. My oldest brother, who I'm very close to, we were camping together this summer. And he looked at me again. We were talking about what he was doing at his church and the leadership he was exhibiting and then the Bible studies he was leading. And it was really fun to hear. And he finally stopped and he says, Ken, you're responsible for where I'm at spiritually. Because I hated God because of your polio, but yet I saw you walking with him and serving him, and I knew I had to move beyond that anger and start serving him too. God uses the hardship in our lives to shape us and to shape those around us. The question we need to ask isn't why, God, but the question is how. How are you going to use this to impact the lives and my life and the lives of the people around me? God's revealed a lot more than this, but we're running out of time, so we need to move on. What I want to do this morning is I want to take time. I know a lot of you have suffered a lot more than I have. You've lost a lot more than just the use of a limb. But I want to take time now for us to spend some real honest time with God, that we can pray, take our hurts, our frustrations, our anger, and quit asking God why, but start asking God how. How are you using this in my life and the lives of the people around me? I wouldn't be the person I am if it wasn't for the polio. And I think God knew that. My wife once told me, Ken, I would have never married you if you hadn't had polio. You would have been insufferable. Love that lady. But where do you need to look at the how and not the why? And where do you need to move beyond and ask to show His glory might be displayed in and through your life? To do this, we need to trust Him. We need to trust Him in all the circumstances of our life and then be obedient to that and lean hard into God's grace. Because y'all, God's grace is sufficient. We need to lean into His grace, trust Him with the results. We want to spend some time now with the Lord doing just that. Give Him over the troubles, the sufferings. It's really beautiful. Paul, in his introduction to 2 Corinthians, says, "Praise be to the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our afflictions, so we can comfort those who are likewise afflicted." God doesn't comfort us to make us comfortable. He comforts us to make us comforters. How is God using your suffering in the lives of those around you? Spend some time with Him now. Thank you.